It began as an ordinary response, the kind that rarely stands out once a shift ends. A call about a disturbance near an apartment complex where complaints were common and expectations were low. When the officer arrived, there was no immediate danger, no raised voices, no urgency in the air. Instead, there was a child sitting alone on the concrete steps, watching the ground as if it held all the answers he needed. He didn't look frightened in the obvious way, but there was a stillness about him that suggested long familiarity with disappointment. The officer approached without authority in his posture, without assumptions in his voice, and asked simple questions that did not demand quick answers. The child responded slowly, carefully choosing words, as if he had learned that saying the wrong thing could make situations worse. He spoke about being alone often, about adults who were present but unavailable, about days that passed without guidance or attention. The officer listened, not interrupting, not correcting, not attempting to fix anything immediately. What stood out was not what the child said, but what he did not expect. He did not expect reassurance. He did not expect help. He did not expect anyone to stay longer than required. As time passed, the officer realized that this encounter was not about enforcement or resolution. It was about absence. About the consistent lack of someone to notice, to explain, to show up. The officer remained longer than necessary, not because policy required it, but because leaving would have reinforced what the child already believed. Their conversation remained simple, grounded in everyday things, school, routines, small details that revealed how much responsibility the child carried on his own. There was no dramatic exchange, no emotional declaration, only the gradual establishment of presence. The officer did not promise anything he could not deliver. He did not position himself as a rescuer. He simply returned when he said he would, spoke when the child asked questions, and remained steady in ways that felt unfamiliar to someone who had learned to expect inconsistency. Over time, these brief encounters accumulated, forming a pattern the child began to rely on. Not because the officer replaced anyone, but because he filled a space that had been left empty for too long. Without intending to, without naming it, the officer became a reference point. Someone whose behavior demonstrated what responsibility looked like. Someone whose attention was not conditional. That was the day something shifted, not suddenly, but permanently. The day a uniform no longer represented authority to that child, but stability. The day a police officer, through quiet consistency, became something closer to a father figure than the child had ever known. As time passed, the officer's presence became something the child quietly anticipated, not with excitement, but with relief. There were no formal meetings, no structured plans, only brief interactions that repeated often enough to feel reliable. The officer checked in when he could, sometimes stopping by under routine pretenses, sometimes simply making time where none was required. The child began to speak more freely, not because he was encouraged to open up, but because he noticed that his words were not dismissed or rushed. He talked about school struggles, about confusion over rules that changed depending on who enforced them, about the pressure of figuring things out alone. The officer responded carefully, never positioning himself as the ultimate authority in the child's life, but offering explanations, guidance, and consistency where it was missing. He showed up the same way each time, calm, attentive, predictable. This repetition mattered more than advice ever could. Gradually, the child's behavior shifted. He became less guarded, less prepared for disappointment. He asked questions he had never asked before, not because he suddenly trusted the world, but because he trusted this one person to answer honestly. The officer noticed the change and understood the responsibility it carried. He remained mindful of boundaries, aware that influence without intention could still shape outcomes. He made sure his actions aligned with what he said, understanding that credibility was built not through authority, but through follow-through. The child began to mirror what he observed, approaching situations with more patience, responding instead of withdrawing, testing the idea that stability could exist without strings attached. There was no defining moment when the relationship changed. No single conversation that marked the transition. Instead, it happened gradually, through accumulated time and shared understanding. The officer did not replace what was missing in the child's life, but he demonstrated what presence looked like. He became an example rather than a solution. In doing so, he altered how the child interpreted adult involvement, not as something temporary or unreliable, but as something that could remain steady without demanding anything in return. Over time, the influence of that steady presence became more visible, not through dramatic changes, but through small, consistent shifts in how the child moved through the world. He began to approach situations with more confidence, less defensiveness, and a growing sense that mistakes were not permanent failures. The officer continued to show up in quiet ways, offering guidance without control, support without expectation. He paid attention to how his words landed, understanding that for someone who had lacked direction, even simple advice could carry weight. The child watched closely, learning not from instruction, but from behavior. He observed how the officer handled frustration, how he communicated boundaries, how he remained composed under pressure. These observations formed an unspoken framework, one the child began to use when navigating his own decisions. The officer never labeled the relationship or claimed a role beyond his responsibility, yet the child's perception shifted naturally. Authority was no longer something to resist or fear. It became something that could coexist with care and fairness. As years passed, the child's circumstances changed, shaped by multiple factors beyond this one connection, but the foundation of consistency remained. When faced with uncertainty, he returned to what he had learned through example, patience, accountability, and restraint. The officer, aware that his involvement would not last forever, focused on reinforcing independence rather than attachment. He encouraged the child to trust his own judgment, to seek guidance without dependence, to understand that support could exist without control. When the time came for their interactions to naturally lessen, there was no sense of loss, only transition. The child did not feel abandoned because the stability had already been internalized. What remained was not a person to rely on, but a model to follow. In that way, the officer's role extended beyond presence. He had provided something durable, something that remained even in absence. Without intending to, and without redefining his duty, he had become a father figure not by position or title, but by example. And that influence continued, quietly shaping a life long after the uniform was no longer part of the child's daily world. As life continued to unfold, the effects of that relationship revealed themselves in ways neither of them had anticipated at the beginning. The officer returned fully to his regular duties, responding to calls, handling responsibilities, and moving through days that looked ordinary from the outside, yet his awareness had subtly changed. He paid closer attention to children who lingered at the edges of situations, those who spoke less but observed more, those who carried themselves as if they were accustomed to figuring things out alone. The experience had sharpened his understanding of how influence often operates quietly, without formal acknowledgement or dramatic turning points. For the child, the passage of time brought new challenges, transitions, and expectations, yet the internal framework he had absorbed remained intact. He learned to evaluate choices not through fear or avoidance, but through the steady lens of accountability and patience. When authority appeared in his life, whether at school or elsewhere, he no longer interpreted it as unpredictable or threatening. Instead, he measured it against the example he had witnessed, recognizing the difference between control and responsibility. There were moments of uncertainty, as there always are, but they no longer carried the same weight. The child had developed an internal reference point that guided him forward, one built not from instruction, but from consistent observation. As their interactions naturally diminished, there was no abrupt ending, no sense of loss that demanded closure. What had been offered was never meant to be permanent in form, only in effect. The officer understood this and allowed the transition to occur without forcing significance onto it. He trusted that the foundation had been set. Years later, the outcomes were visible in subtle ways, in how the child approached relationships, in how he responded to setbacks, in how he carried himself with a quiet sense of direction. The officer did not take credit, nor did the child frame his progress around a single influence. Yet the connection remained present as a silent factor, woven into the structure of growth. In the absence of labels or declarations, what endured was an understanding that guidance does not require authority, and that consistency can provide what instruction alone cannot. The officer's role had ended in form, but not in impact, leaving behind something stable, transferable, and lasting. As the years moved forward, both lives continued along separate paths, shaped by countless influences, yet quietly connected by that early period of consistency and presence. The officer remained in his profession, carrying forward the same calm approach that had defined his interactions with the child, now applied more broadly to the communities and individuals he encountered. He never spoke publicly about that experience, never framed it as a defining moment, but it informed how he understood responsibility beyond written duty. He recognized that authority could be exercised without force, and that guidance did not always require permanence to be meaningful. For the child, now older and increasingly independent, the impact of those early interactions manifested not as memory, but as instinct. He approached challenges with deliberation rather than avoidance, responded to uncertainty with patience instead of fear, and evaluated guidance based on consistency rather than position. The absence of a constant figure no longer felt destabilizing because stability had been internalized. What he had received was not protection, but orientation. Not answers, but a model for how to engage with the world responsibly. There was no single moment where he consciously identified the officer as a father figure, yet the role existed in effect if not in name. It had been defined through behavior rather than obligation, through repetition rather than declaration. When the paths of the officer and the child eventually crossed again, if they did at all, it required no explanation or recognition. The significance of what had occurred did not depend on acknowledgement. It existed independently, having already shaped outcomes in ways neither needed to articulate. The officer did not view the child's progress as an extension of himself, and the child did not frame his growth as something owed. That mutual absence of ownership was what allowed the influence to remain intact. In the end, the story did not resolve with reunion or affirmation. It resolved through continuity. Through the understanding that guidance offered without expectation can outlast proximity, and that presence, when consistent and restrained, can redefine what support looks like. The day the officer became a father figure was not marked by ceremony or intention, but by choice repeated quietly over time. And that choice continued to matter long after it no longer required action, leaving behind a foundation strong enough to stand on its own.